it's a really important fact about the world that ideas can simultaneously have both very good properties and very bad ones simultaneously.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. What you are about to hear is quite possibly the most difficult conversation I've ever had. I almost didn't do it. In my preparation for this interview, there were several times where I wanted to cancel it, which is exactly why I had to do it. Let me explain. My guest this week is Andy Norman. Andy is an author, researcher, and philosopher. And Andy is an atheist. And I am a Christian. When I first came across Andy's new book, Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think, I saw the title and immediately reached out to him to invite him onto the show. He accepted, and I started reading the book. Without giving too much away from Andy's work and from our conversation, because I want you to hear it, Andy has some thoughts and insights about quote-unquote bad ideas and how to combat them that I absolutely love. And he has some views and beliefs that are in direct conflict with my faith. And this is why I started to doubt my choice to bring Andy onto the show. As I forged deeper into Andy's book, I'll be honest, some parts of it made me scoff, some made me irritated, and some flat out angered me. So much so that there were some nights I had a hard time falling asleep because my mind was racing with arguments and comebacks to counter Andy's ideas. I created an entire back and forth debate in my head, one where I shot down and refuted every point that Andy in my head made with fortitude and righteousness. It's what we do all the time. We create narratives about people who think and feel and believe differently than we do. We craft assumptions that begin to turn disagreements into, forgive my perhaps obvious pun here, into holy wars. And then we begin to distance ourselves and set ourselves apart. We retreat into our tribes and echo chambers and feel good about ourselves. And I so badly wanted to do this with Andy. But what would I be if I had canceled the interview? I'll tell you what I'd be. I'd be a hypocrite to the worst degree. And guess what? I am so glad Andy and I connected. Because what you're about to hear is an example of how two people with very opposite viewpoints can come together and have a conversation where they strongly disagree, yet leave the conversation with an immense amount of respect shared between them. And in many ways, Andy and I have a ton of overlapping ideas. But I didn't set out to change Andy's mind. I simply wanted to ask him questions to understand him better. And you'll hear, Andy asks me some tough questions that caused me to deeply examine my beliefs long after our conversation ended. I reflected on this conversation for weeks, and I hope you do too. We certainly are no strangers over the last 18 months to the idea of viruses and immunity and all that surrounds that. But
yes.
Why this book at this time? Why write about mental immunity at this time?
Well, I was thinking about sort of deformations of thought, ways in which people's thinking goes haywire long, long before COVID came along. So I'm a philosopher by training, and my specialty is in a subdiscipline called epistemology, and that's just a fancy word for sort of thinking about how we can think better, right? So what many people think of as critical thinking, I now believe is better viewed as a kind of mental immune system. So in the same way that our body's immune system protects us from infectious microbes, it now turns out, based on the latest science, that our minds have immune systems that protect us from infectious ideas. Of course, they don't always perform at peak capacity. And this is why we need to learn how our mind's immune systems work and how we can make them work better.
Critical thinking, why is that not enough? You touch on this in the book. Why is critical thinking not the perfect explanation in your mind?
Well, it's possible that we could eventually assemble enough insights under the label critical thinking to actually prevent the spread of viral nonsense. But the concept of critical thinking has been around for about a century now, and it's patently failing to do the job of preventing outbreaks of unreason from spreading around our world and wreaking havoc. So in the internet age, where we're all just one click away from thousands of people, many of whom have disinformation or misinformation to spread, we actually need to raise our game. We need to take it to another level. And what passes for critical thinking instruction in universities is just not up to the task of inoculating minds against the worst forms of cognitive contagion. But I think that this new framework that the concepts of immunology provide, right? You take the concepts of immunology from the bodily health, and you translate them over onto questions about the mind and the contents of the mind. And it turns out you start to see all kinds of interesting ways in which we can raise our game.
Where is the failing with critical thinking? You mentioned the education system, but is it in how it's taught, or where do you see the failings of critical thinking?
So I've taught critical thinking for about 25 years in universities, and it's not that I disapprove of critical thinking. I think it's a wonderful concept. It's just a very crude and kind of clumsy instrument. It's kind of a vague term for, I don't know, asking lots of questions, examining arguments, and trying not to let bad ideas slip in. The problem is that nexus of ideas, I mean, what you can layer on top of that is practice examining and finding the flaws in arguments. And that's the way most critical thinking textbooks work. But it's just not a clear enough, crisp enough, or scientifically rigorous enough approach to protecting our minds from bad ideas. In other words, most of us congratulate ourselves on being perfectly adequate critical thinkers. Thank you very much. It's those other people who lack critical thinking, right? But basically everybody in today's world is running around thinking that. Right? I'm a critical thinker. What's wrong with them? Right? What we don't have is a unifying framework for thinking about how we can think together better. And that's what the concepts of what I call cognitive immunology provide.
So what does a healthy mind, and that's different from mental health, what does a healthy mind look like to you?
Yeah, so I argue, in fact, I've just been invited to speak to a state psychological association about the implications of mental immune health for mental health more generally. So the concept of mental immune health is kind of a new one, and one that I'm proud to be sort of helping to develop. And it's not widely recognized that that's an important aspect of overall health. But just think about the kind of stories that have been making it into the news in recent months. So a person is feeling disillusioned and disaffected. They're browsing online and they get sucked down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole. And before you know it, they believe a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles runs our nation. Right? We've seen stories like this play out again and again. So how does that happen? Why is it that some minds are susceptible to QAnon belief and others are not? What is it that some minds have that others don't? Well, I would argue that it's best understood as a kind of immunity to a certain kind of nonsense. So we need to get better, all of us need to get better at spotting and removing bad ideas. And the ancient philosophical discipline of epistemology has many hundreds of insights about how we can do that better. And so in the book, I take these insights from this ancient discipline and translate it into accessible modern terms and say, hey, look, if we view our minds as having immune systems that we can enhance, that we can boost, that we can, right, in the same way that a vaccine trains the body immune system how to recognize and eliminate, say, COVID, you can train the mind's immune system to recognize and reject conspiracy thinking. So, in fact, there are leading thinkers in the field now that are actually experimenting with what they call mind inoculation techniques. And they're finding that if you expose a mind to the right kinds of things, you can make them less prone to, say, climate denial, climate change denial.
Now, Andy, mind inoculation techniques sounds, if taken the wrong way, a little bit devious, perhaps.
I'm sure that some will react that way, yes.
What do you mean by that? Because, yeah, some people are going to take mind inoculation techniques as you're trying to control the mind.
Right. So the idea isn't. So I'm not a fan of thought police. I'm certainly don't imagine that I'm the person who should decide for everyone what's worth believing and what's not. But I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we'll recognize that bad ideas often sneak past our mind's defenses and that we need help spotting and removing them. So what philosophers discovered thousands of years ago is that a kind of idea testing, conversational idea testing called Socratic inquiry or Socratic method. You've probably, this questioning methodology pioneered by the ancient Greek philosopher named Socrates. Turns out that's one of the most powerful mind inoculants ever invented. And it's been around for 2,500 years, but we don't employ it in a regular way or with any discipline in our day-to-day lives. So I'm not talking about sticking needles into your brain. I'm not talking about, me or a cabal of cognitive immunologists deciding for everybody what we should think. The idea is to empower everyone to participate competently in the practice of collaborative idea testing. And if you know the rules or the norms of reason-giving dialogue, and you can follow them in a spirit of collaboration with others, your ability to detect and remove bad ideas can be greatly enhanced. And of course, that's a lesson that philosophers have known for a long time. If you question things the way Socrates did, you're much more likely to spot bad ideas. But now we can frame all of those ideas in the language of immunology and say, this is a health issue too. Think about what happens to a person who gets sucked down the QAnon rabbit hole. They start to lose their friends. They start to have strained relationships with their families. They start to feel as though the entire world is conspiring against them. These are not aspects of mental immune health. These are, in other words, QAnon belief is a precursor to what might be called a mental illness. It's certainly a kind of mental dysfunction of a kind. And so by protecting people from destructive or harmful or disorienting ideas, we can help them be healthier and wiser versions of themselves.
What determines and makes up a bad idea?
That's a foundational question, and it's a terrific follow-up question. Nicely done. Yeah, I think it's certainly incumbent on me to say what I mean by bad idea, given this research program. And I don't mean anything particularly fancy or unusual by it. So most everybody would agree that truth is a good quality in an idea and falsehood is a bad quality. Let's posit both of those as excellent guidelines. Now, some ideas are also helpful and other ideas are harmful. All else being equal, an idea being helpful is a good thing, and ideas being harmful is a bad thing. An idea can be inspiring, that's good. An idea can be dispiriting, that can be bad. An idea can make you more prone to behaviors that harm others, and an idea can be prone to make you more likely to do things that help others. So, so there are many different qualities. Beliefs have different ideas have different properties, and these properties affect human minds in characteristic ways. Some of them in ways that promote human flourishing, and others would detract from human flourishing. So the trick is to fill our minds with ideas that are true and beneficial, mutually beneficial, not just personally beneficial, and to weed out the stuff that is both false, either false or harmful. So we all know the basic answer to your question. We know what kinds of qualities make ideas good or bad. We just need to get past the idea that the goodness or badness of ideas is, it's all just subjective. It's all just, who am I to say which ideas are good or which ideas are bad? So here's the thing, right? When somebody murders somebody, none of us have any qualms about coming out and saying that's a bad behavior. When somebody comes out and actually advocates for insurrection, why are we so reluctant to say that's a bad idea? Because we've been trained by our culture to be basically relativists about goodness and badness in thinking. There's a prevailing orthodoxy that says everybody should be allowed to believe whatever they want. And anytime somebody speaks frankly about bad ideas, they're basically trying to be thought police. And who are they to say? That's a dysfunctional orthodoxy that prevents us from testing ideas properly. And it leaves our minds wide open to mental infections of all kinds of sorts. Mental infections we should have weeded out a generation or two ago.
I want to come back to that thought, but first I want to ask, you had mentioned earlier that there is a lack of rigor in the general population, or a lack of discipline to employ the methods of Socrates' teaching, the Socratic method. Why do you feel that is? Why do you feel that is not a discipline that we regularly employ?
I think the answer is multifaceted. So, for one thing, many people sneer at philosophy as trivial, hair-splitting, useless. How are you going to pay the rent with a philosophy degree, right? I mean, we philosophers get that all the time. Part of it is that we don't always have the patience to ask the clarifying questions first. We rather jump to conclusions and start criticizing. So Socrates taught that if you take some time to patiently ask clarifying questions and understand what the other person is trying to say, if you do that first, a lot of times it turns out you have much more in common with that person than you think. And the conversation is much more likely to be constructive because the person to whom you're addressing the clarifying questions feels listened to and valued and understood. So if we all learn to do this, our conversations can become dramatically more empowering and uplifting episodes in our life. Every single conversation we have represents an opportunity to deepen our thinking. And yet, the truly deep conversations are so exceedingly rare in our superficial commercial society. There's got to be tons and tons of room for improvement here. I argue that in the book, I point out that if you take the number of person hours that humanity has every day and if everybody on the planet devoted 10 minutes a day to Socratic idea testing, we would collectively be allocating billions of person hours to weeding out bad ideas out of the collective meme pool each and every day. Imagine a billion person hours of weeding out harmful ideas from the collective mindset that we share. What could that do over time? A billion hours of look, if you put a billion hours of weeding into your garden is going to look pretty damn good. If you put a billion hours of weeding out bad ideas into our collective worldview, our collective consciousness, our thinking is going to become dramatically better, and our world is going to become dramatically more enlightened.
I can see the passion with which you speak about this, and you just outlined a case for why this show exists. So I thank you for that.
We're very much working the same row here, I think.
I think so when it comes to this, for sure. You've been, like you said from the onset, you've been at this for a while. Are there things or characteristics that you see? You talked about the lack of patience. Has that gotten worse over the course of your studying this and looking at this?
It's certainly gotten worse as America has descended into a culture war. So as partisanship rises, partisans become increasingly impatient with what they view as the derangement of the people on the other side. And it gets harder and harder to have constructive dialogues under conditions like that. So, I really started thinking about this problem in the early 1980s when the culture wars were just beginning to heat up. And I could see already back then where it was headed. I didn't foresee a Donald Trump, but I foresaw deep cultural divisions being exacerbated over time. And I knew that we would have to think more deeply about competent idea testing and how to have constructive dialogue if we were going to solve this problem. So my real passion, my scholarly expertise is how dialogue works, not just to lead us to truth, but how dialogue can work to resolve our differences. So I actually study how dialogue works to do that and identify ways in which dialogue breaks down, leaving us all poorer.
Now I'm making a mark to come back to ways dialogue breaks down, but to go back again to what we were talking about in bad ideas. The question that I had as I was reading your book, Andy, was, okay, you posit that bad ideas are like a virus that can spread, that can attack our mental immune system. What is a good idea?
So I think there are a couple of things going on in your question. One is, I think you're channeling what is likely to be discomfort among many of your listeners about the whole concept of a mind parasite. It's like, that's a creepy thought, right? My mind is actually infected by parasites. So I'm saying something there that is a little bit, is meant to get your attention, but it's not that different from saying, bad ideas manage to set up shop in everybody's mind. Think about some of the qualities that bad ideas possess. They need a host. They infect minds, and they often harm their hosts. So what do you call something that infects a host and harms it? I would call it a parasite. We don't traditionally think of bad ideas that way, but there's nothing preventing us from doing so. And it actually proves illuminating to do that. That's, I think, I heard that kind of going on in the background of your question, but I need to come back to your question about good ideas too. Let me give a few examples just to keep it concrete. I think the idea that we should treat other people the way we like to be treated, I think that's a really good idea. I think it's an idea that has induced a lot of people to become better people, better versions of themselves. Think about the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. That's a really good idea. Think about the idea that gravity exists and it obeys Newton's laws. That idea has enabled us to do so much in terms of aviation and understanding how objects on our planet behave. It's a really good idea because it's true. It's a really good idea because it's useful. So truth and usefulness are the two basic things to look for in ideas, and the best ideas are both true and useful. So that's the short answer. Of course, a related question would be how do you tell if an idea is a good one? And my answer to that is that we subject them to a Socratic questioning and see how they do. If an idea can't withstand vigorous questioning, it's probably not a good one, probably not worth relying on, and almost certainly not worth believing. So the way to tell whether an idea is good is to bat it around in conversation with your friends, prod it with questions, especially clarifying questions, and see what happens. If you can come up with good answers to the objections that arise, that idea might be worth hanging on to. If you can't, it's probably not.
To clarify my question, the idea that a bad idea spreads like a parasite and has the same effects or causes the same harm to its host. If an idea spreads in the same way but is good, what do we call that?
Nice. So there's certainly examples of such things. So biologists call critters that live within you but help you rather than harm you are called symbionts. So biologists call a relationship between a host and a beneficial parasite a symbiotic. And sometimes they'll use the word symbiont instead of parasite because parasite has bad connotations. Symbiont should have positive ones. So I think there are mind symbionts as well as mind parasites. And some of those ideas I just mentioned as good ones, the idea that human beings have rights. I didn't mention that before, but that would be on my top 10 list of the great ideas of all time. Human beings have basic rights that we all need to honor. And yes, such ideas can spread in what you might call a viral way. The idea that human beings have rights spread rapidly across Europe in the 17th and 18th century and reduced violence by more than an order of magnitude. So killings of many different kinds, violence of many different kinds declined by 9/10 or more on many different dimensions in the wake of the spread of human rights. I think that's a very powerful example of the kind of thing you're talking about, where good ideas can spread and benefit humanity.
And sticking on the violence theme, and forgive me, I don't like what about questions, but I'm going to ask one here.
Quite all right.
What about where good and bad seemingly coexist within the same idea? I'm thinking the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, stealing to feed your children, Alex Honnold free soloing El Capitan in Yosemite and inspiring a generation of other free soloers. What do we make of those situations where good and bad coexist?
That's a beautiful question, a beautiful follow-up question. And it's a really important fact about the world that ideas can simultaneously have both very good properties and very bad ones simultaneously, right? So how many American lives were saved by the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? But how many innocent Japanese people died, right? Good and bad coexisting. So perfect example of that. I can't help but think another example I would think is immigration policy. There are good people in America who come down on both sides of the immigration issue, some because they're worried that immigrants will take their jobs or reduce their demand for their labor, which is a rationale we can all understand, and other people who understand that allowing immigrants to enter our country is a humane thing to do to people who might be suffering, might be refugees, say from Afghanistan or a failing state in South America. So yeah, and those are the hardest ideas. Like that are the hardest ones to reach agreement on about whether they're good or bad, right? The issues get really, really complex, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say, yeah, I've got the magic formula to decide whether those ideas are good or bad. Often these ideas are profoundly mixed in their positive and negative qualities, and that it's really important to keep that in mind. We shouldn't enter the idea of idea testing with a false sense that it's all going to be easy and simple, because it doesn't often work out that way.
Are those the situations, to go back to what we were discussing earlier, where you see dialogue break down the most?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So even in Plato's dialogues, Socrates points out that if you have a disagreement about whether a certain mathematical equation is true, you just see if you can produce the proof. You either produce the proof or fail to, and that kind of often settles the matter, right? But when you have a disagreement about right or wrong, or about how to organize your politics, or about whose religion is the right religion, those ideas often become very difficult to adjudicate in dialogue. So unless you practice the art of constructive dialogue, the way I do week in and week out with my students, those issues can become frightfully difficult to navigate. But I can tell you that with the right approach, and if you bring the right collaborative spirit, those conversations can become so illuminating. They can deepen your understanding and help you become wiser. And I'm so privileged to work with a group of students that picks out one of life's big questions every week, some of which are politically fraught, others of which are theologically or morally fraught. And each and every week we go deep on it, and we maintain a collaborative spirit, and we share insights. And often these issues prove to be profoundly complex and ambiguous in just the way that you mentioned. But understanding that is itself part of becoming a slightly wiser version of yourself, I think.
Something that I've been saying recently, Andy, is that understanding does not equal agreement. Is that true in the work that you do? Do you see that to be the case?
Yeah, so it's certainly possible for you and I to disagree about something, for you to understand what I'm saying, for me to understand what you're saying, but for us not to agree on who's right. But we can also use the term understanding to mean like mutual understanding and agreement, or consensus understand. Like, so when we together converge on the truth through after investigating together, and we arrive at that truth and we both go, oh, okay, well, there it is. That would be a case of our shared of your understanding and my understanding converging, and our shared understanding corresponding to reality, to the truth. If that's what you mean by understanding, it's the kind of thing that automatically dissolves disagreement. but that's a richer kind of understanding than we typically mean. A lot of times when we enter conversation, we just go, I'm going to try to understand what you're saying, but I'm not going to begin testing your ideas because that might become antagonistic, and we shy away from that. I think really deep dialogue begins by taking the time to really just understand one another, and then tries to take it to the next level by saying, all right, well, who's got which piece of the truth here? Which piece of the truth do you have a hold of? And which piece of the truth do I have a hold of? And how do we combine those into a larger, deeper, shared understanding of the reality? So there's a lot of people who work in what's called bridging work. So there's over 350 organizations in America that are trying to bring conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats together to actually dialogue together and understand that there are decent people on the other side, and to really listen to one another. It's beautiful stuff. But a lot of them are reluctant to go beyond simply having the two sides hear one another. They're reluctant to kind of nudge the conversation to that next level where people say, all right, well, let's buckle down and really just figure out who's right about what. Right? But we actually need to seek that deeper kind of shared understanding, I think, if we're going to get past this cultural impasse that we're currently at.
That, what you just said, why is that so difficult? Why is that so difficult to examine belief?
Yes, a part of it is that we come to identify with our beliefs. And when other people come along and say, hey, those beliefs, those don't make sense, we get really defensive, right? So if you identify as a liberal, as I do, a lot of times you can get defensive really fast when somebody said liberalism is buck. If you identify as a Republican, then somebody comes along and says something disparaging about republicanism, you get defensive really fast. And one of the things we know about the human mind is that when you feel defensive, your mind's immune system doesn't work very well. In fact, it overreacts to perceived threats. So if I feel as though my fundamental beliefs are being dismissed or derided, I will get defensive really fast. Sometimes I will. But when I'm a better version of myself, I'll calm myself down and say, all right, don't overreact. Let's hear this guy out. Maybe I can learn something from him. I'm sure whatever piece of the truth I do have a hold of, I'm sure it's incomplete and in need of development. So let's learn what I can from this person who's challenging me. If you can do that and sort of de-escalate the conversation and more importantly, de-escalate your own defensive reaction to kind of lower your own, to be less defensive, lower your own, lower the walls that protect your identity, then you can have the kind of transformative dialogue that really changes hearts and minds. But you have to create an environment where people feel comfortable lowering their defenses and actually being willing to rethink core elements of their identity. One way, of course, to start down this path is to try not to identify strongly with any set of beliefs. Because when you do, your mind starts to close to certain kinds of questions and challenges. So I actually argue, I invite people to consider identifying with honest inquiry rather than with any particular set of beliefs that might come out of inquiry. Because however far along we are on our path to learning, whatever beliefs you have now will probably need modifying at some point in the future. So don't get too attached to them. Otherwise, you stop learning.
So, Andy, you're diving into areas of faith. Are you not?
I am.
You spend a lot of time in the book discussing faith.
I do.
Why?
So I think there's a lot going on behind the word faith. So sometimes, so there's a kind of religious faith that basically says, this is my belief and I'm sticking with it no matter what. If you don't agree with it, go away. I don't want to hear it. That I call that bad faith. And I think it's a very destructive force in the world. It actually compromises mental immune systems, closes minds, hardens hearts, and divides humanity into irreconcilable factions. But there's something else that people mean by faith, and it's a far more positive thing. Think about somebody who's just resolutely hopeful. I have a religious friend who lives right down the street who just brings the most upbeat, hopeful, trusting attitude to everything he does. And it's inspiring, consistently inspiring. I want to be more like that guy every day. Now, for him, that hopefulness and that ability to trust others derives from his religion. At least he feels it does. I think we can learn to be resolutely hopeful and trusting without the religious, without the metaphysics of religion, without it buying into the kind of dubious metaphysics of many religions. But so I think we need to be really careful spreading the idea that faith is a virtue, because history tells a long, sad story about people embracing things, accepting them on faith, and then becoming dogmatic about it. So when faith becomes an excuse that protects your dogmatism, I think you're doing yourself a disservice.
Is there a distinction between faith and religious legality? Does that make a difference?
Religious legality?
Yes.
Yeah, so I would say that we should, each and every one of us, have the legal right to believe what we like. I'm not interested in empowering a thought police that would make religious belief illegal. I think that would be a big, big mistake. But I'm not at all sure we have a moral right to believe what we want religiously. Suppose I happen to believe that God wants me to drown infidels, and this belief actually becomes part of what governs my behavior. I'm harming others. That belief induces me to harm others. Should I have a right to that belief? Do you really want to say I have a right to such beliefs? I don't. I think it's important that we recognize that our cognitive responsibilities often supersede our cognitive rights. And we have a responsibility to believe things like try not to harm others, be kind, be generous of spirit. These are ideas that really, really do benefit humanity for objectively measurable reasons. And we should be in the business of believing them and spreading them. I will staunchly defend I will staunchly oppose any attempt to make religious belief illegal, but I will exhort people to think about the possibly the dark side of religious faith that they might otherwise overlook, and try to do the responsible thing.
So, Andy, in any faith that any of the major religions, I'll say, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, I don't know of any teaching that says God wants you to drown infidels or drown the others. Is that not an outside condition that exists outside of the world of that faith?
So you're right. I'm not aware of any such teaching either. But let me give you an example. So there's a passage in the Quran that tells believers to, quote, smite the necks of non-believers. And there are, in 2014, I think it was 2014, there were over 300 people beheaded by Islamic extremists because they took that passage of sacred scripture literally and seriously. 300 people lost their lives to beheading because a particular passage in a sacred text could be interpreted as commanding believers to behead non-believers. That's a fact. You can look it up. And of course, there are many other teachings in all of the major religions that are problematic, right? I think we need to be candid about this. So Thomas Jefferson took his copy of the Bible, took a pair of scissors and cut out all the stuff that is probably morally retrograde, left the stuff that's actually morally uplifting. It's called the Jefferson Bible, and he actually said, we actually need to be discriminating about which of these teachings benefit us and which of these teachings don't. Why is it so hard for religious believers today to take on that same responsibility and begin to say, you know what, this, that, and the other ideas don't belong in our canon at all. These other ideas do, and they need to be developed and amplified. Why can't we do that? Why is it? In part, we don't, in part because the concept of faith tells us to just obediently accept the teachings of our tradition rather than take responsibility for improving those traditions.
Do you lose context if you begin to cut away the parts of, for instance, the Bible that happened before, as a Christian would believe, that happened before the new covenant of Jesus, that while the Old Testament is there and it was a very acts and works-based culture, by cutting out the things where you have, you have slavery in the Bible, you have these other things contextually within that framework that, as you come into the teachings of the gospel in Jesus, don't negate those things, but provide the context for the belief of Christians moving forward.
That's a fine point.
By curating that, do you lose context?
Right. I think that expresses, I think, a valid consideration, and one that all people of goodwill have to acknowledge. Look, I think the fact that some of the Old Testament teachings differ in important ways from New Testament teachings, while also bringing out the worst. Some of them, I think, bring out the worst in people. It's important that we understand that about our past. It's important that that young people be raised to see the context, to understand that there was a time before the New Testament came along when people thought very differently. All of those are, I think, important things. But is it a good idea to treat the Old Testament as sacred when it contains passages that, for example, say, if your son or your daughter, your wife or your husband turns away from the true Lord, then you must kill him? I don't have the passage, but there is a passage like that in the Old Testament. Thou shalt kill someone who turns away from the Lord our God. That's not an enlightened teaching. That's not a teaching that benefits humanity. And it certainly shouldn't be treated as sacred. Because when you teach kids to regard a book as sacred, they will often accept its teachings uncritically and sometimes act on them and behead people.
You've got me thinking here, Andy. I'm now trying to put it into the context of, let's talk about the larger social discussion that I think is going on right now, which is the teaching of our own history here in America.
Yes, good.
In that context, if we don't teach slavery and what was the belief at the time, do we lose the context of the progress that we have made? Do we lose the context of why the Emancipation Proclamation was even necessary?
Right. So I'm not advocating that we don't teach kids that slavery existed, right? So think about the controversy over some of the Confederate statues celebrating Confederate generals.
Yeah.
So on the one side, you've got people saying we should not be celebrating these people who fought to preserve this terrible institution, slavery, which is a fair point, right? And you've got other people saying it's part of our history and we need the context. Well, that's a point too that I think deserves some consideration. What if we took statues of, say, Robert E. Lee, right, a famous Confederate general, put them in a museum and contextualize it in such a way that people could understand the full horror of slavery and understood, say, why many Southerners think of Robert E. Lee as a hero. That would be quite different from leaving it out in a public square where the context suggests that this guy stood for something that deserves to be celebrated. Mm-hmm. Right? I think a similar approach could be used to handle questions of race and in our history, the Old Testament. I mean, look, we need to be honest about our past and to understand it in all its messy, gory glory. And we need to be careful not to endorse things that no longer deserve to be endorsed. We shouldn't be celebrating the past in ways that perpetuate injustice.
And you and I can agree on that point for sure. My question, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, is can the two not coexist? In the same way that you can have a good and a bad idea and you can debate that, Christianity, belief in God, whatever religion you ascribe to, I believe you term it responsible believing. Can those things not coexist and be true at the same time? Can my belief in God not be true and I believe in climate change? I believe in evolution. I believe in the scientific method. I believe that science and the evolution theory, not theory, just evolution, bring about God's creation, rather than disprove it. Can the two not coexist?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible for them to coexist in the same mind, right? And I can't rule out the possibility that all of those claims will prove in the long run to be true. I don't think we have very good evidence for thinking God exists today. So if you haven't guessed already, I'm a non-believer.
If you haven't guessed already, I am a believer.
That's fine. That's fine. I think many people don't understand that the word atheist actually technically means lacking belief in God. So atheist doesn't mean you run around objecting to belief in God at every turn. An atheist is just somebody who, when they look inside themselves for belief, like honest belief that God exists, finds that it isn't there. So if you lack belief in God's existence, you are an atheist, whether you embrace the label or not. But that's I think a side question. I want to get at your deeper question. So I take it you do think that we have good reason to believe in God's existence.
Let me characterize it in the framework of a story that you gave in the book. Actually, was it Bill Nye who was the scientist who was engaged in this debate? And I forget the other gentleman's name. So Bill Nye was representing the scientific community, and I forget the other.
Ken Ham was it?
Ken Ham was representing the faith, the Christian viewpoint, and the moderator of this debate asked both men a fantastic question, which I advocate for all the time. What would it take for you to change your mind?
Yeah.
Bill Nye says evidence. Wonderful. The Ken Ham says, well, nothing will change my mind.
Right.
If I can offer up a different answer to that question, and you sort of touched on it there.
Yeah.
Evidence that God does not exist. And I don't believe we have. I had an astrophysicist who discovered who helped take the first picture ever of a black hole. Scientist, well respected in his field, and also a devout Christian. And that, to me, his example and the things that he writes in his book about his marrying belief in God with his scientific inquiry, the two can coexist and not be harmful, or not be a virus we have to immunize.
Okay. So it's certainly true that, scientists like that, who's earned his scientific credentials and simultaneously harbors belief in God, is an example that those beliefs can coexist in the same mind. I readily concede that point. I guess my question for that scientist would be, what standards does he or she employ when doing science, and what standards of responsible believing does he or she employ in their religious life? And if the standards are different, why? And what standards? So I've yet to see a person of faith articulate a standard of responsible believing that allows them to include their religious belief, but exclude religious beliefs that they reject. So I think you mentioned you're a person of faith, a Christian in particular.
Yes.
Do you have a standard of responsible believing that under which your belief in the Christian God passes muster, but the the Hindu belief in multiple gods doesn't pass muster?
I'm trying to think through your question. Can you repeat it again? Because I didn't quite follow.
Yeah, that's fine. So, I think we should all be able to agree that we should believe responsibly. It's not okay to run around and believing things that harm other people, say, or that just flout basic norms of responsible thinking and talking. But then the question becomes, what are those standards? And so what's the right test for a responsible belief? If you ask many scientists, they'll say, well, there has to be sufficient evidence, or it doesn't count as responsible. And if you apply that standard, and that's the standard that applies in much of science, if you apply it to religious belief, many people conclude, well, that's different. You don't need sufficient evidence. We don't need sufficient evidence to believe in God, because that's a matter of faith. So what you're doing there is using the concept of faith to carve out an exception to an otherwise general standard of responsible believing. And the question I have is, why is that not just kind of like a get out of jail free card? Well, how do we keep the concept of faith from becoming just an all-purpose excuse for believing whatever you want?
I think there are things that are true and unexplainable. Okay. Where does morality come from? Who's to say what morals are? Where did humans even grasp the concept of morality in the way that other mammals do not? Why do we even have these questions? Why do we even have these conversations? Like, what gain in our propitiation as a species does considering these questions gain us, when a dolphin never ponders its place in the universe. And there are
that we know.
right, that we know. Why did an amalgamation of gas and matter floating out in space over eons create a sentient being capable of having these discussions? That I don't know that we have a fantastic answer to. And I wholly concede the point that faith should not be used as a get out of jail free card to believe whatever you want.
Good.
But the tenets of at least my faith, that there is a belief of something greater than myself guiding and creating a world in which to share and spread that belief, and understanding that there are other people that believe that way. I think that's where free will comes into place. And this is...
Hey, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're certainly right that many of the ideas I put forward can create discomfort for people of faith. And I'm actually admire that your candor and honesty and that you're representing for that. So let me let's see. You said I'm sorry. I'm blanking here for a second. This might be a part you have to. I'll ask you to delete out.
I can repeat.
If I can't collect my thoughts properly. Okay. So your belief in a higher power, is this an idea do you believe because it's comforting? Because it helps to keep you humble? Because it helps to explain how creatures with morals could have emerged from an otherwise barren, universe of rocks and space dust? Or is it something that you actually have evidence for? Because I think those are different things.
I can say, at what point, and I would pose it a question back to you, at what point is what we believe not evidence? And what is the characterization of evidence? Is it physical? Is it physical evidence, or is there a higher level of belief needed when it comes to evidence? Like, what creates good and bad evidence, right?
Okay, great question.
But to answer your question, because I don't want to seem like I'm getting around it.
I didn't frame it very well, so
the question was, is it comforting to help explain the things that are unexplainable, or is it simply because I don't have evidence?
Well, would you characterize your God belief as evidence-based, or does it function in your mental universe as useful and comforting and perhaps moralizing? And is that why you hold it, or is it because that you actually have something like physical evidence from God's existence?
It certainly does the first, comforting, helps provide a compass of a life well lived, right? The second part gets to what I was saying is what I perceive and hold to be evidence in my own life, and things that I would attribute to God. That's evidence to me, right?
Okay.
And like, in the same way that I cannot provide evidence to you that I love my wife, I cannot provide you physical evidence, testable evidence of God.
I think you could actually provide what I would consider reasonable evidence that you love your wife. Just, showing your devotion to her, your concern for her, your care for her, I think to me.
Could I do that? Could I do that for malicious reason, like selfish? Could I do that for reasons other than simply a absolute love for her?
Sure, it's possible to feign love, right? But I think the odds of that are pretty low, because you seem like too decent a guy for that.
I love my wife. I love my wife.
I know you do.
Take that as evidence.
I know you do. Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this: so philosophers distinguish between practical reasons for believing and what they call epistemic reasons for believing. So there's the kind of reason you might have. So if you believe something because it's useful, that's one thing. But if you believe something because you have evidence for thinking it's true, that's different. My view about religious belief is that it persists for long stretches of time, in part because it proves psychologically and socially beneficial, which is to say it may be useful without necessarily being true. Or it could even religious beliefs often have the properties that make them stick in human minds, whether or not they're true. They have a kind of appeal, a stickiness that more secular beliefs sometimes don't. So there's a whole branch of the evolutionists are now looking at how the mind could have been shaped to want and crave and need religious belief. And the stories they're telling to me are pretty compelling. It seems to me likely that the human animal evolved used by Darwinian principles, and in the process evolved a set of psychological propensities that makes religious belief a combination of comforting and useful and maybe even serving as a kind of social glue. The bonds that form between people who share a religion are often quite strong.
We are certainly a tribal people. Yes.
Human beings generally are pretty tribal, right?
Yes.
And that has both a light side and a dark side, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So I actually like to say I'd love to help develop a worldview that celebrates us without demonizing any of them. And Jesus's advice to love your enemies and to love your neighbor as you would yourself. These are very similar ideas, and ideas I admire deeply, and I like to credit Jesus and Christianity for spreading those ideas. I think that's a big part, a very important story about humanity's moral evolution.
I know we are short on time, and I have one more final question to ask you, but real quick clarification about what you said there. Actually, yeah. Jesus changed that directive to love others as you love yourself. Jesus said to love others as I have loved you, because I think in a lot of ways, we don't like ourselves very much. We don't love ourselves very much. And there was a slight change in the New Testament under the umbrella of the New Covenant where he says, love others as I have loved you, because Christianity teaches us that God's love is perfect. So that God is love. So
I stand corrected and appreciate the clarification on that.
Andy, I appreciate that this is exactly what I wanted to do, was have this conversation with you, knowing and having read all of your book, that you and I disagree on some things, but that there are threads of common ground that we can agree on. And I appreciate you being willing to have this conversation with me. The last question that I have for you that I ask of all my guests is, what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I'm going to buy myself a moment to think about that by saying how much I enjoy finding common ground with people like you who are curious and interesting and smart, and the process of finding common ground and learning to understand how other people view things is one I cherish, and it's been a privilege to do this with you.
Thank you, sir.
One question I wish other people would ask me more. How about what's next for me?
What's next for you?
Why, thank you. How kind of you to ask.
Nothing like a good setup, right?
So I think I mentioned that I call this emerging science of mental immunity cognitive immunology. I think this science could do as much for human well-being as the original bodily immunology did. So in the same way that vaccines have saved hundreds of millions of human lives, I think the principles of cognitive immunology can prevent divisive ideologies from harming future generations. So my project now involves building a research institute that brings together thinkers from many different fields to explore the possibilities that mind inoculation and cognitive immunology offer, so that we're not driven into mutually irreconcilable camps, and so culture wars don't erupt and devolve into violence. I would love to see the principles of responsible thinking spread so that humanity can consistently work out its difference in conversations like this, rather than the kind of online flame wars that seem to pass for public discourse these days.
Andy, I look forward to following your work, to seeing the results of that, and keep it up. I think it's important.
And you too, Michael. I love what you're doing with the podcast, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir. So many thanks to Andy Norman for coming on the show and sharing his story and his ideas this week. Please do me and Andy a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and how we can find common ground even when we disagree. If you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Andy Norman that I have on each episode, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss a conversation. Subscribing also helps the show gain more reach, and that always helps your independent podcaster here. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until then, keep asking questions.